Dobar večer. Moje ime je sem novinar koncu in danes mi je veliko veselje predstavljati Keitha Lowa z njegovo knjigo Podivjana celina v, ne najdem prave besede, sjajnem, fantastičnem, prelepem prevodu Brede Piščak, ki je že itak dobro napisano knjigo, britanski zgodovinarji znajo pisati, spravlja v slovenščino brezhibno, tako da je v veselje brati, čeprav tema mogoče ni najbolj razveseljiva. Išla je pri založbi Modrijan, prečitati moram protokol s finančno podporo javne agencije za knjigo. Ta pogovor je nastal v koprodukciji s Cankarjevim domom in v sodelovanju z Inštitutom za novejšo zgodovino. Pogovor je simultano prevajan, kar bo potekal v angleščini. Če je kdo pozabil, lahko pri vhodu dobi prevajalno pripravo, pustnik mora pa posebni dokument. Ko bomo končali s pogovorom, ki bo trajal skupaj bo avtor pisoval knjige. Now, let's switch to Christian languages. Good evening, and welcome. You've come to the right place with you. The subject was written for us. And I have so many things to ask you, but maybe we should start with summing up. I mean, you know, and the subject for us is not new. We have been obsessed with this story for at least 30 years, public, hundreds of years. And welcome to the fray. This is not a neutral subject.
No,
and it's not Great Britain, so we don't spare.
Not only here, actually, all across Europe, it's a controversial subject.
And it's not your first book. The first was the British bombing of Hamburg.
Yes.
That's a war crime probably on its own.
Absolutely.
And a first question is related to the date. I mean, we're talking also at the right time. It's a couple of weeks actually to the 70th anniversary of Victory Day in Europe, and a couple of months later will be 20 years from Srebrenica, which was somehow advocated as with events from World War II also. So we have historical continuity. And before we go to the questions, I have many. I would like you to sum up the book.
Okay. Yeah, well, in one sentence. Okay. It's a book about what happened next, really. I mean, it struck me that we have this idea of what the Second World War is. You know, the Second World War began for us in Europe in 1939, finished May the 8th or May the 9th, 1945, and then what happens next? You know, you can't take an event as big as the Second World War, as huge, with so much military activity and so many deaths and so much destruction, and then stop it dead on a single day. That just doesn't happen. So I wanted to explore what happened next. How did people come out of this cataclysm? Did they simply put their guns down and go back to normal life, or did they want to carry on fighting? And what I found was that actually all across Europe, not just here, but everywhere, there was a lot of unfinished business. So whether you're in Norway or in Czechoslovakia or here in Slovenia or in Greece, there are people everywhere who have business that they want to finish, which has been created by the Second World War. So originally I was going to write only about Germany.
But it wasn't only about Germany.
Well, it was going to, I was actually commissioned to write a book about Germany. But the more I read about Germany, the more I realised actually, this has been written about a lot of times, in lots of languages. But all the things which are happening in Germany are also happening elsewhere around Europe. The same things are happening everywhere. So I went to my editor and I said, you know, actually, Germany's been done quite a lot and I'm not so interested in Germany, but do you know what was happening in Poland? Do you know what was happening in Ukraine? And I told her these stories. And eventually she said, okay, forget that book. You need another 2 years, go away and write about the whole of Europe. So that's how this book came about. It's about the whole of Europe in the aftermath of the war.
So, it's May 9th, 1945. People are kissing in the streets.
Yes.
It's spring, the trees are blooming, and this is the image that we have from all the movies, from the most beautiful pictures in black and white from Times Square.
Yes.
To everywhere in
Wonderful
Europe.
celebration.
Yeah, it's the end of war. And the rest we forgot.
Yeah.
Or pushed away, avoided. But what happened? I mean, what happened on that day? What started on that day? I mean, the images that we saw must have been real.
Yes, they're real, absolutely.
But there's another reality that the whole continent at one point decided never really happened. What happened? I mean,
Well,
how did Europe actually look?
How did Europe actually look? Well, I mean, first of all, there's a huge amount of destruction everywhere, and I don't only mean there's physical destruction, of course. Whole cities have been destroyed, whole villages have been burnt down, and so on, all across the continent. There's a huge amount of physical destruction. And there's also human destruction, of course. I mean, 40 million people were killed during the Second World War. So that's a lot of families all around Europe who are suffering, you know, they're in mourning at the end of the war. It's all very well to be dancing in the streets for one day, but you know, your father is still dead, or your sister has been raped, or you know, you can't continue to be happy beyond that one day of celebration. But on top of that, you also have a sort of moral damage which has been created by the war. So, you know, whole populations have been subjected to extreme violence. Some people have witnessed extreme violence day after day after day for months, years. You come out of that, you're not a normal person. You're not the same person you were before the war began. This is going to have an effect on you for years, for the rest of your life. So there's a sort of moral damage which comes out. Also, you know, in order to survive during the war, people had to rob, people had to steal, people had to kill. You know, they had to do these things in order to survive. So they have, you know, there's a moral damage which is within ordinary people that they might not necessarily recognise at the end of the war, but you know, they have changed themselves. So all of these things, the physical damage, the human damage, the displacements of people, and the moral damage that has been created by the war, all of that, you know, there was of course hope, there was celebration, but mixed with this there was also all these really quite difficult, quite painful parts of people's lives that are kind of hidden beneath this story of celebration.
And what your book describes in detail, and you really write well, I mean, my compliments. It's rare that you find such a gruesome subject, except in horror novels, I mean, written so well.
Thank you.
And yet with a distance that it's impossible to even imagine inside Eastern Europe. I mean, you're like European. I mean,
it's easier being an outsider.
But
I don't write very much about Britain in the book, so.
You have your own subject.
Exactly.
I understand it completely. But what you write about is basically various aspects of revenge.
Yeah.
And revenge took many forms. It's actually amazing how a rather simple process can become so complex and complicated, involving not individuals who go and settle accounts, but whole nations that push millions across the borders after the war has ended.
Yeah.
And so, one thing that comes out of the book is that, and it's unpleasant for me, is that I knew this, but somehow this makes it evident, that war in Eastern Europe was much more horrible and brutal than it was in Western Europe.
Oh, absolutely,
I
unquestionably.
mean, but on one side, the Germans in Eastern Europe lost all control, which they did in parts of France, but for the rest, compared to Ukraine, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, those places, they really didn't have any limits. Poland, and that revenge took. There are two aspects. One is that revenge was more or less uniform all across Europe. In Eastern Europe, it was just a little bit more rare.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is I remember talking to this. I was sitting in a room talking to a Polish guy and a French guy, and they were arguing about the fact that okay, in France they have this myth that everybody was in the resistance. And the Polish guy was making fun of this French guy, saying, you all think you were in the resistance, but half of you were collaborators. We Poles, none of us resisted. And of course the Frenchman said, well, of course you didn't resist, you weren't given the choice. You know, this is the difference between East and West Europe. In the West, the Nazis were pretty horrible, but they were not that horrible. They allowed people to collaborate. They allowed ordinary government to kind of continue in a warped way. But once they went east, it was a completely different story. It was Armageddon, you know. So when you come to the end of the war, the reaction is proportional to what had happened during the war. So of course in France there is a certain amount of revenge, but it's low key compared to the East, and in the East it's terrible. In Poland they expelled 10 to 12 million Germans who lived in the eastern parts of Germany and in Poland, were expelled across the border. 12 million people. Given half an hour to gather some things and get out, and marched out of the country. So can you imagine? I mean, this is the biggest forced migration in history. 12 million people being pushed across the border into a country which is already destroyed, so they have nowhere to go when they get there. I mean, that's just one example of revenge. I mean, the list is endless. So, for example, you also have Germans being rounded up and put into, they were called transit camps because they were supposed to be deported, but actually while they were there, they were used as forced labour, and the people who were in charge of them wanted to do the same to them as had been done to the Poles or to the Jews, and they made an absolute point of doing that. So they beat them, they tortured them, they raped them, and so on. And this is all happening after the war. So, the violence continues wherever you are. It's. I have to say, the research for this book did give me nightmares. It was really. I was quite depressed after I finished writing it.
Well, but you take a burden from us because you explain something that was deemed to be unexplainable. I mean, and Germany paid the price. They paid a high price, right? Because they created most of evil during the war.
Yeah.
And besides, what was the price for Germany actually? Okay, they lost territory and they lost population, but that was not all.
Well, I mean, they became kind of untouchable after the war. I mean, to be German was to be a pariah. Nobody liked Germans after the war. In fact, we still see it today. The last Czech elections, there was Karel Schwarzenberg was rejected because he had a German name, and people said he was too German to be part of the establishment and so on. And they're still burning swastikas in Greece. People still carry this with them today. Germany is still kind of the black sheep of Europe, even though it's the most wealthy country. So, I mean, Germany lost, not only did they lose territory and they lost a lot of people, and 6 million people killed during the war, 500,000 died afterwards in various acts of revenge. Aside from that, they also lost, you know, their reputation, their pride, really. German pride is not like it was in the 19th century, and never will be again.
And it was not only the Germans, but it was the Ukrainians, the Polish.
Well, I mean, Germany is just one example. The same things are happening everywhere. So, you know, when just talking about expulsions of populations, for example, when the Germans went into Ukraine, they wanted to kill all the Jews. So they got Ukrainian nationalists to come and join them and help them to identify the Jews, round them up, kill them. Now, these Ukrainian nationalists are learning methods of killing populations from the Nazis. So, you know, why stop at the Jews? They want to have their own Ukraine. They want a Ukraine for the Ukrainians. So they then round up all the Poles and start to kill them, burn Polish villages, chase Polish people out of what they considered Ukraine. So, you know, when the entry of the Nazis into Ukraine opens up a whole sort of ethnic Pandora's box, which is difficult to shut once the war is over. So the way that they decided to solve this problem after the war was to separate the two populations. So, you know, the Ukrainians are put over that side of the border and the Polish people are put on this side of the border. But that involves expelling huge numbers of people. Hundreds of thousands of people are told to leave their homes and go over the border. Now that's only Ukraine. You also had Hungarians being expelled from Slovakia. You had Italians being expelled from Slovenia. You had you know, Albanians being thrown out of Greece, and so on. All around Europe, these things were happening. The reason I concentrate on Germany is simply because that's the biggest one. You know, it's such a huge event, 12 million people. But you know, the same thing is happening everywhere else as well.
And one chapter of the book is called Yugoslavia in the Small. It's really lovely to read because this is how we always saw ourselves. And it's not just Europe, but the whole world, because Yugoslavia was a model of everything. And somehow, I mean, this territory manages to have the most horrible of wars and the most horrible of peaces.
Yeah.
I mean, I borrow a title from Franklin about the Middle East. This was the peace to end all peace.
Yeah.
And why was Yugoslavia so special? What did you find?
Well, I mean, Yugoslavia is simultaneously special and actually not special, but quite typical.
Don't say that. It was special.
It was, of course. I mean, part of the problem is that we have a very limited idea of what the Second World War was. You know, the usual story is that you have these two titanic armies. You've got the Allies on this side and the Axis on that side, and they fight one another, and then you know, May the 8th, it's all over, and then it's finished. Well, that's a very simplistic way of looking at the war, because at the same time as that was happening, you also had, you know, a sort of political, civil war going on in most countries between the right and the left. You had a sort of the communists wanting to take over, so there's a class war going on as well. And then, as in Yugoslavia and in Ukraine, you also have this sort of ethnic dimension to the war. So there's actually four things going on at the same time. Now, just because you remove the Allies and the Axis, just because Germany is defeated, that doesn't mean the other three things can't continue. So, you know, in Greece, you have a civil war between the communist partisans and the nationalists. In Italy, you have the same thing. In France, you have the same thing, really, on a smaller scale. Here, you have all of these things happening simultaneously. There's a real ethnic dimension thrown into the mix, which once you put an ethnic dimension into anything, it makes, you know, the emotions get higher. Things become more sort of emotional, dangerous. But then you couple that with the politics and all the trauma that everyone's just experienced. Well, I mean, that's a recipe for disaster, isn't it?
And Slovenia, excuse me, but we regard Slovenia as a really special case. And in various ways. I mean, I would really like to hear you about our country. We love it in a special way. You know, this place is full of crosses. You go to the valley of the river of Socha, and you find 1 million crosses. Would they say it's normal to find 1 million crosses in a Christian country? But there are up in the mountains, 2,000 meters high, there are Muslim cemeteries with the nishans, because General Borojevic brought the Bosnians in World War I. You have in Yugoslavia, which is just across the border in the town where I was born, Novo. There's a nice ossuary built by Mussolini, 50,000. A friend of mine lives nearby. It's very peaceful. You go to Kobari, Caporetto, I don't know, tens of thousands bones. World War I. There is a small village called Čepova, where you have a small village cemetery on one side, on the left side. There is a monument to villagers who died in World War I, 100 names. On this side, there's a monument to villagers who died in World War II, another 100 names, Slovenian. Plus, it says 3 Italians, 1 Mongol. And then you open any newspaper from the 90s on, every 6 months you find stories about mass graves. What happened for us after World War II is that the whole German army, retreating from Greece, carrying with themselves everybody, the Czechs, the Mongols, the Ukrainians, the Azeris, the local militias. And they all ended up here in one corner, surrendering to the Brits, and the Brits gallantly came back.
Yes, I'll find this.
We signed this paper in Tehran, I think it was. And so 80,000 graves, according to one count. Plus 14,000 Slovenians account settled at home. Oh, and I wonder, what does a historian does with a story like this? How do you approach it? I mean, how do you understand it? How do you...
Well, I'm not entirely sure that I do. I mean, Slovenia is like it's a crossroads, isn't it? I mean, if you're going to get from the west to the east, if you're going to get into the Balkans from Italy, this is the place where you have to pass through. And equally, if you're coming from Turkey to invade in the 16th century, you come through here. You come through what was Yugoslavia. So the former Yugoslavia was a crossroads of languages, of cultures, of religions, and with all these little sort of different ethnic groups as well thrown in. So there's a lot. There's a huge diversity here, which where I live now in the 21st century is a fantastic thing. We love diversity. Diversity is like a word which we use as a celebration in London. But it's only a celebration if those different communities can get on. And there's always somebody who will want to pit somebody against someone else. Us against them, Now the opportunities in a place full of diversity are much greater for that, aren't they? So this is where you end up with, when you get a fascist organisation arriving and setting up during the Second World War, who are absolutely obsessed with the idea of racial purity, where does diversity fit into that? So once you get that sort of thing happening,
You took the easy way out, but let's stay on the subject for a little while. I mean, you complain.
In what way did I take the easy way out?
Because in the book you complain that these events are politically manipulated, they are subject to historical revisionism.
Oh yes.
They are treated like as if they happened yesterday.
But they have happened yesterday. I mean, if you undergo a trauma, I mean, if any of us undergo a severe trauma, that doesn't just disappear. Years later, people have flashbacks and so on. That's all that's happening now. People remember it like it was yesterday, because to them it's still inside them. They're still living with it now. It is yesterday. That's why the emotions are still so strong around this subject.
So how do you explain the fact, how old are they?
44.
44. You're a kid. So how do you explain the fact that a 44-year-old kid in 2014 is the first one to write a comprehensive book about the end of World War II, after Tony Judd wrote Post-War, where he approached the subject. Yugoslavia was a footnote. And how come, I mean, if it's so easy and self-evident, how come it wasn't approached before?
Well, this astounds me, actually. You know, when I explained this to my editor originally, when I was commissioned to write the book, her eyes sort of lit up. She said, there must be a book on this already. And we looked, we spent months looking, and it would have helped me out with the research, believe me. But there wasn't one. And the only thing I can think of to explain this is that, you know, we have the Second World War is a nice fairy tale, isn't it? You have good against evil, fighting for to save the world, and eventually good wins and the world is saved, and then everything goes back to normal again. And nobody likes to think that actually perhaps things didn't go back to normal, because that spoils the fairy tale. So, you know, people don't like to destroy their myths. These are very sort of cherished by us. We value our myths, our fairy tales. So, yeah, nobody else seemed to have, particularly focused on this one. I mean, the Second World War was full of myths, and a lot of them have been exploded and so on. But this was one which nobody had kind of got round to, I suppose. I don't know. And
I think Tony Judd has this idea that Europe needed this myth in order to recreate itself.
Well, there is that too, yes. Yeah.
So would it be correct to say that this story was removed in order to create normality?
That's a very strong argument for that. I mean, if you have this sort of great cataclysm which affected us all, this Second World War, this big, it's like the end of the world. And actually, if you read any of the letters and the diaries and so on of people writing at the time in 1945, especially Allied officials, when they go to Germany or Poland or whatever, that's how they write about it. They say that it's Armageddon, and they say it's like the last judgment has happened. Now, the corollary of that is that it allows you to build a brand new world. And what is the brand new world that we live in today? Well, it started off with a nice, Western Europe being all together, and this has now grown into a European Union. The Second World War is the myth which holds the European Union together. And without it, what else is there that keeps the whole of Europe together? We've got so many differences. There are so many people trying to highlight our differences. That this threat of what could happen, we could go back to that cataclysm. That threat is what holds Europe together, I think. So the idea that that this disaster didn't come to an end, but it actually carried on, is very inconvenient if you want to create a myth of unity.
I keep on thinking about Judd and his book. It's not fair to you and your book, but there's one quote from Carlyle that he quotes, and I think that I love it immensely. And he says, if things be left undone, they will do themselves in time, in a fashion nobody will like. And this is actually what happened with your story, right? I mean, this was removed from our collective memory. It came out in different bits and pieces all over Europe. I think the Ukrainians have had the same problem in Maidan last year. I think They were discussing not the Russians of today, but
Yeah, exactly. It was being
Hitler
transported
and Stalin. And that was, and it happens all over the place, but sporadically. Now you put this together in a system. And what correction have you made to our perceived history of the war? The war is still there as it was. It just gets a new color.
Yeah, I mean, it's just the idea that there's nothing neat about the war. We'd like to put things in nice, neat packages, and that doesn't work. And it cannot, with a subject that big, you can't put it in it begins on this date and finishes on that date. It involves these people and those people, and they did this, and that's it. It's messy. And I mean, life is messy. And if you don't recognise that life is messy, and that history is messy, and that nothing can be put into a nice, neat little package, then you're missing the whole point. And that's when history repeats itself, because you can't see what has actually happened, and you can't see how we are still reacting to the same stimuli now. If you don't look at it properly and see the reality behind it, that actually life is messy, and you have to accept this. If you don't accept it, then it happens all over again.
I'll just check how much time have we left, because I'm under strict orders here. Oh, we still have time. Good.
I was actually asked when I went to Estonia, and I was asked by an interviewer there. She was quite. I went in with a big smile on my face, and she was quite stern. She asked me angrily. She said, "Why are you stirring all this back up again? Isn't that irresponsible?" Now, I'm not stirring anything up. It's there, whether we like it or not. It's there anyway. If you can't bear to look at it, as Carlyle says, it will come out in its own way, and it won't be a way that you will have any control over. So it's better to look at it, and look at it in the face, and deal with it, as an adult.
What else did the people say when you started asking? Because you spoke to people who were present at the time, to people who wrote about it. What reactions did you get from people when you approached it? Could you tell me your story?
Mostly good reaction. I mean, I interviewed quite a few people who had never really told this story to anybody. In fact, there was this one.
Because nobody asked?
Partly because nobody had asked, because it's not the subject. Everyone knows about the war. People ask about the war, but they don't ask about what happens next, because that's not in our consciousness. But also because they themselves hadn't really thought that much about it. They'd lived their lives and moved on, and had kind of forgotten it themselves. So, there was this one Polish guy, I remember. He was amazing. He had the most incredible memory of this time between sort of 1945 and 1955, when he was in a displaced persons camp. He was there from the age of 9 until the age of 19. And this was the formative part of his life. He remembered in such great detail exactly what he was doing during these years. When he was Polish, but he was being forced to live in Germany. He couldn't go back to Poland because his part of Poland wasn't actually Poland anymore. So he was living in exile in a displaced persons camp throughout the whole of his childhood. And the stories he was telling, it was like his face lit up as he remembered all the bits of ammunition that he found and blew up in the woods, and the guns he played with his friends, and real guns. As a 9-year-old, he'd find a Panzerfaust lying in the woods and would fire it with his friends to see what would happen. He'd never really told these stories to anybody before. After we had the interview, I recorded it all. He said, Can I have that recording, because I've never told my son about this, and he would like to know, I'm sure. I feel slightly embarrassed about talking to him about it. But if I can give him the recording, then he will perhaps understand a little bit more about me. So yeah, it's an emotional thing that people don't always like to revisit. Once they do, it brings them alive,
But, I mean, after the aftermath of war, the general reaction of the Europeans was silence. And it wasn't just individual silence, it was institutional silence.
Yes.
I mean, in this country, you spoke about the revenge after World War II, you went to jail if you were, or if you were a writer, you were prohibited from appearing in public. So the whole Eastern Europe was the same. You only talked about the enemy. Right?
Yeah.
But there was institutional silence in France about this also. There was institutional silence in the Netherlands. I mean, places that we look. It's Sweden. I mean, had a horrible story. I mean, the Nordic countries.
Yes.
They couldn't deal with the fact that they were occupied and collaborated, and institutionally stopped the story. How do you explain this? I mean, this was not.
I mean, institutions are like people. They behave badly, and they didn't really want to talk about it. You know, it's the same as if you get a group of people, whether that be an institution or just a group of friends. They have a sort of communal psychology. So they react in the same way that an individual does, but just on a larger scale. So they have an institutional memory that they don't want to talk about. It's quite normal.
I'm at peace now. You solved one of my problems. But I would like to complicate this. Everybody has his own traumatic experiences. Mine is Srebrenica, and for various reasons. One is because it was the only genocide that I covered the Bosnian War and more or less witnessed the whole thing, and it stays with you. But on the other side, one doesn't know how to deal with this. And I went at the 10th anniversary. I went to Srebrenica, and the then Reis Ulema of the Bosnian Muslims was giving a medal to Mazowiecki, the ex-prime minister of Poland, who resigned as a special envoy of the UN because of Srebrenica. He said, this is genocide endorsed by the United Nations. I don't want to have anything to do with it. So Ceric was giving him a medal. And he said something that stuck with me as a problem to solve, and I would like you to help me. He said, I will not explain why I'm giving the medal to this man. Because good is simple, evil is complicated, and you don't have to explain good. It's self-evident. Here's the medal. Then I interviewed him a few months ago, Ceric, not Mazowiecki, he died a couple of years ago. And I asked him what did you mean by that? And he said, well, once you start explaining evil, you have to understand it. Once you understand it, you find the reason for it. Reasons. Once you have the reasons, it's very easily to apologize. And in the end, you realize that, there isn't that much difference between good and evil. Well, at the beginning, you knew that the difference is there. And, I mean, what I liked about this book, and it's that you somehow avoid the trap of passing judgment of who was right and who was wrong and what's the correct interpretation of this. But at the same time, you're not, you just don't just write the chronicles. You express the period in its complexity, and you don't explain much. You don't explain why it happened, really. How did you avoid the trap?
I don't think there is a great deal of value in judging, to be honest. I mean, evil is evil, but it's like your interviewee said. Once you start to understand what created this evil, you begin to realise that actually, given the right circumstances, I can imagine I might act like that as well.
That's a horrible thing.
It's a horrible thing. It's a really horrible thing.
These were normal people like me.
Well, exactly. These were normal people. And you know, there have been all kinds of psychological studies into what's his name? I can't remember. Some experiments which were done in the United States in the 1960s and 70s. Milgram, yeah. I mean, this is something which is in all of us. We were all capable of acting in this way, really. Well, I mean, I say we all are. There's a sort of moral switch that most of us have, but there's a large proportion of people, and a surprising proportion of people, who are able to override that moral switch. And you don't know whether you're one of those until you're put into that position. So to sit in judgment of people that, I don't really see how it adds value. I mean, the whole point of this book is to show that it's not only Germans who acted like this. It's not only Slovenians or communists or Muslims or whatever category you want to put people into. Everyone acted like this. Everyone behaved badly. This was the Second World War. Everyone behaved badly. My country. We like to think that we are the heroes of the Second World War. But we were the ones who sent those 14,000 Slovenians back across the border. We were the ones who killed 500,000 German civilians by dropping bombs all over their cities and destroying them without any discrimination, which was, even at the time, a war crime. Yet we went ahead and did it, and we don't like to call it a war crime. We don't like to think about it, because we were the heroes. But we're not the heroes. We're the same as everybody else. So sitting in judgment, I don't think is it's difficult not to do, actually, but I don't think it adds value.
So before I open the floor to the public, I would like to end on a lighter note. There's this movie called Burn After Reading.
Okay.
And the last scene is the CIA really screws up a major world situation, and the chief of the CIA asks his deputy, so what have you learned from this? And the other says, not to do it again. And I think that's what I got from your book. I mean, it's really a bad idea to do it again. Yeah. and swearing that it will not happen again doesn't help. It will, but the moral switch you were talking about, yes, has to be checked from time to time on smaller things. So
we must look at ourselves as well as others.
So I will stop here with my questions and open the floor. And thank you for a really fantastic book. I mean, this was a revelation in many ways. And so I'll switch to Slovenian for a second.
Okay.
And then, zdaj bomo odprli prostor za vprašanje iz publike. Časa imamo dobre pol ure. Izvolite, prosim, če se predstavite pa...
My name is Dimitri Richard. I'm also involved. Sorry, can you hear me all? My name is Dimitri Richard. I'm also an author. In fact, after I retired, I also wrote a novel with a historic background, which also touches on a lot of post-war events, although it is in Austria, so I'm dealing a great deal with Austria and the Austrian history during the Second World War. You sort of avoided the question of research. I'm very much interested in how much you've done. I gather that it took you about 2 years to write this book. Five years. Okay. So how did you approach actually, how much research did you need to do? How much did you travel? How many institutions did you contact? How many people did you interview? Where did you gather your documents? This is my main question, because this really interests me, because I know writing a book with a historical background means doing a great deal of work, a great deal of research. It's really a big project, whoever undergoes to do something like that. The other thing, what I wanted to say, you were saying why these subjects weren't approached earlier. Because these subjects were, I would say, categorically avoided. in many countries. There are many reasons. If you go to Austria today, they don't teach in schools what was happening during the World War II in Austria. They don't teach that.
Well, they were a victim of Nazism.
They were not.
They were the first victim.
No, that is a misconception.
No, I know, of course. I'm saying that ironically.
They were willing collaborators, or they say they were victims, yes. But there were 500,000 SS members in Austria. And 1/2 of guards in the concentration camps were Austrians. Hitler was Austrian. Eichmann was Austrian.
Yeah.
A lot of these leading Nazis were Austrian. So, but this is not discussed. This is not taught in schools. This is not discussed. And this is a bad subject. I mean, if you want to mention this somewhere to someone in Austria, you'll really get somebody in a bad mood.
Yeah.
So this goes on. I mean, this attitude of trying to repress or not be objective or trying to be not open about certain issues is still going on in a lot of places. Of course, it's in places like Holland and France, it's a question of embarrassment. These countries, especially the Dutch, who are also, a lot of them willing collaborators, are very much embarrassed about their role and their collaboration in World War II. So,
well, I mean, we all have our national myths. I mean, if you go to Poland, for example, you know, the Polish sort of national myth is that they were the victims, and Poles have always been, throughout history, they've always been the sort of archetypal victim of Europe. And the Second World War only went to prove that, you know, they were the real victims. Now, the idea that after the war they did some terrible things to Germans and to Ukrainians and so on, I mean, that's really difficult for a Polish person because they're the victims, they're not the perpetrators. It's very difficult to come to terms with such things. You know, we British, we're the heroes, so we don't like to think of ourselves as perpetrators either. Everybody has their national myths, so it's not just Austria, it's all of us. Now,
The subject of research.
Yeah, the research. Now, when the research for this, I mean, God, I could have carried on researching for 30 years and not scratched the surface, to be honest. The way I approached it was, first of all, I did a huge amount of secondary reading, which was difficult in itself because there was nothing which drew together the whole of Europe. I had to go to read French books in French, German books in German, Italian books in Italian. I don't speak Slovenian or Croatian or Polish, so I had to get other people to read those books for me and summarize them. Then when I'd gathered enough of that information, I then had to hire research assistants to go to places where I couldn't speak the language and dig out documents, which was incredibly difficult. Because, when you're doing it yourself, you know what you're looking for, and it's simple. Well, I say it's simple, but at least when you come across something, you know that's the document I was looking for. Someone else is doing it for you. They could be turning down all kinds of things without you knowing. And also, they give you a whole load of stuff which is useless, and you end up spending a lot of money. So, just for example, I had 4 people researching for me in Poland, and 2 of them, actually, I ended up spending a lot of money on and having to then just let them go because they weren't really, they had their own ideas of what I should be writing about. But the other 2 were incredible, and they were on the phone to me every day. This is what I found, is this the right kind of thing? Yes, then give me more of that. So they go away and find more of that, and so on. The same with Croatian archives. French, I was lucky because my sister lives in Paris and she's a French translator for UNICEF, so that made life easier. My mother-in-law is Hungarian, so she translated whole books of Hungarian for me. So, to some degree, it was a little bit like being a project manager rather than being an author. It's only at the end that I then have to gather together all this information and somehow make sense of it. That's where the real work began, I suppose, in some ways.
But there's a problem that whatever one says about the Germans and they were unpleasant during World War II. But they kept a very meticulous record. I mean, everything was put down on record and checked. I mean, the registers of the death camps were sort of perfect. They look like they were written kept for historians, so that the thing wouldn't be forgotten. While the aftermath of the war was, I mean, I'll phrase it as a question: was the aftermath put on record anywhere?
Yes, yeah. I mean, there are. I mean, they've been published. There's a whole books full of documents which have been published by the German ministry. There was a ministry for expellees, for example, which yes, there was maybe not a ministry, but
they had
an organ, yeah, and they gathered together affidavits from thousands of people and had them, sworn with lawyers and signed and so on. So that, and they're all documented
But this is for Germany. In Yugoslavia, you cannot find one piece of paper signed by anybody ordering anything. I mean, this is a complete erasure of history. Is it the same for the rest of Europe?
Greece was incredibly difficult because the archives are quite sort of shambolic, and it's also really difficult to get any kind of access to them. And this is because the civil war in Greece is something that they still don't like to talk about, and they brush it under the carpet and pretend it didn't happen. So for that, I had to rely on archives in the King's College in London, where expats have laid down what they think. But again, you're there. You're having a very. It's always really tricky because everybody's got an agenda when they write down these stories, and you have to take that into account when you're dealing with people's personal history. Why are they telling this story? What side of the political line do they come from? What ethnic group do they come from? Are they being biased in some way? It's really a minefield. I mean, I was just saying to someone the other day, the problem I had here was trying to find. There are lots of stories told by people who were victims of, who escaped from mass graves because they were shot through the shoulder and they lay there pretended they were dead. They come out and they tell their story, but there's no one from the other side. There's nobody who has written down why they shot the people, what were their motives, who were their orders, who was telling them what to do. These documents don't exist. It's only from the victim's perspective. So you're only getting a partial view of what happened. It's very difficult.
We have a question on that side. Oh, we have two actually, so yes, go ahead.
Good evening, my name is Sasha Petian. What stayed with me is the moral dimension that you mentioned. And as far as I know, the moral injury, it's a recent research after trauma and the impact, especially after Afghanistan, as far as I'm aware of. I'm interested how you became aware of this dimension, the moral dimension, and if you can give us examples of the impact in the present.
The impact of
moral injury.
Of moral injury from the Second World War.
Yeah, after the Second World War, yeah.
From after the Second World War. Firstly, can I say sorry for I've had my back to you guys for most of this evening. Let me think. So the moral impact. I mean, this idea that we're all living with our national myths and so on. I mean, this is a moral thing. This is hypocrisy, really, by all of us. We're all as bad as each other. We're only remembering the things we want to remember. We don't remember the more difficult sides of the story. So I mean, straight away, that's a moral implication of the war. We're all hypocrites. I mean, for a more specific example, let me think. I might come back to that. Something might pop into my head. But I mean, that's the first thing that springs to mind, our hypocrisy.
So on the back.
My name is Mirko Ziegler. First, congratulations for this very timely book. Now, since your first edition back in 2012, I guess that you have had many presentations and discussions like this all over the Europe. What you can tell us, what's common across the Europe in this discussion, and what are specificities from one place to another?
Yeah, no, that's. I have noticed both commonalities and differences in different countries. So the most common reaction I've had everywhere is one of surprise. You know, why don't we know about this? Why haven't we been told about this? You know, why don't we know that the same things were happening in all these different countries? You know, each country seems to know a bit about their own history and what happened immediately after the war, just for them. But they don't know what was happening next door. There's been also surprise at how huge some of these events are. You know, tens of thousands of people being massacred. Why don't we all know about this? But then each individual country does have their own sort of take on things. So I mentioned the Poles earlier. You know, I had a very hostile interview actually with a man. It wasn't only one man. A panel of 3 arrived to grill me, and they spent an hour asking me questions about 1 page of the book. They weren't interested in any of the rest. They wanted to ask me about the Kielce massacre of Jews in Poland. And you know this story. In 1946, this town in Poland, they rounded on their Jewish population. You know, this is after the Holocaust, and massacred sort of 30 or 40 of these people. He was incensed by this. He was so cross that he wanted to ask me about every single detail, and he wanted to sort of try and find some way that I'd got something wrong. And he managed to find a few chinks, and because, you know, I'm not a specialist in this subject. I'm treating the whole of Europe, so this is just 1 page of the book. And he found a few little minor details that I'd got wrong, which he concentrated on and questioned me about them again and again and again. And I came away thinking, what just happened there? Why was he doing this? You know, he seemed to be ignoring the message of the book, which is not that Poles are bad, but that we're all as bad as each other. And it dawned on me that, you know, for him, he was younger than me. It was still a really sore point. You know, this was not history. This was something which he believed affected him now, him personally. You know, I was attacking his identity. Now, I also mentioned Estonia. There was a similar thing there, you know, but their focus was on the partisans, you know, because the partisans were all heroes. We were resisting the Soviets. They don't like people questioning their heroism. So wherever I went, the national myths were different, but the reaction to you poking their national myths was always the same. So I hope that answers the question.
What about Russia?
Russia, well, yeah, I haven't been to Russia, but it has been published in Russian, although I haven't seen an edition, and I haven't been invited. So
It's such a pity you don't understand Slovenian. You would have the time of your life reading our newspaper. So any more questions? Prashanya? Yeah. Gentleman in the back. But I guess this is in Polish.
Hello, good evening. My name is Sanjay Bandel. You spoke about also in the book about the problem of all those refugees and displaced persons just after the war, after the so-called Stunde Null. But perhaps there was also a problem because all the generals like Bradley, Montgomery, they were not used to, they were not trained what to do with those people. They were used to lead armies, not to lead a couple of millions of people, to feed them, to register them and send them home. And then thousands of them said, oh yes, we are post, but we don't want to go home because there are communists there. Let us go to the west. Just like those Jews on the day when those Russian cavalrymen said, no, don't go to the east, they hate you. Go to the west and get yourself some food over in the city down there. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, you're absolutely right. The Second World War generals were in charge of moving these huge amounts of displaced persons. I mean, just within Germany, at the end of the war, there were 8 million people from other countries who had been brought there as slave labour in various forms. What did you do with all these people? The only thing that the British and Americans and the Soviets actually wanted to do was to send them back to wherever they'd come from as quickly as possible, regardless of whether or not they wanted to go. So they were quite brutal about it, actually, quite inhumane. They weren't, they weren't. The United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration were quite humane about it, but also quite naive, and allowed these people to do whatever they liked, quite often. The armies wanted to keep them in line, keep them in sort of military-style camps, with curfews and so on, which was, when you're dealing with traumatized people, is not necessarily the ideal way to get, nurse them back to mental health. So yeah, you're right. It was they weren't qualified to do that job. That's for sure.
And there's a problem with that. And a friend of mine, who's a member of the Italian minority, a colleague, a journalist living in Slovenia, he always complained that in any history dealing with World War II and the aftermath, there was the transfer of population from Istria and Dalmatia to Italy is treated lightly, usually in a footnote, and not really treated as a serious problem. I will not say war crime, whatever terminology. It's difficult to find a terminology. But we all, I think, grew up with the idea that the Italians, and there were anything between 100,000 and 300,000 living on Yugoslav territory, that they at one point democratically decided as one man to sort of go to Italy, because life was better there. I mean, you didn't really discuss evictions, forced expulsions, or the creating of conditions that were unbearable, or just.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is what Stalin said to was it Gomulka, whoever was in charge of Poland at the time. He said that you don't want to have these Germans, so just make life uncomfortable for them. They'll leave of their own free will, and you can do. The same thing was done all around Europe. You make life uncomfortable for the group you don't want there. You don't necessarily have to push them out. You can encourage them to leave of their own accord, not you.
Yeah, but why is the subject avoided?
Why is the subject avoided? Well, if you're going to talk about expulsions, then the Italian expulsion from Istria is, compared to the other expulsion, especially the Germans, it is small. I mean, it might not seem small to the 100,000 people who are there, but compared to the 12 million. So we always get the story of the 12 million.
So if you're in a war, it's really a bad idea to be small, right?
Oh, absolutely. Don't be small in a war.
Come on. Gospodin zadnji, prosim.
Lahko slovensko vprašam.
Izvolite, can you put the translator, the machine, whatever? Channel 2.
Torej, definicija vojnega zločina pravzaprav v Evropi je bila postavljena v procesu v Nürnbergu, v Nürnberških procesih. In tam je bila seveda obtožena stran, ki je izgubila, in v bistvu stran, ki je zmagala.
You'll have to translate for me.
Okay, I will try to. The definition of the war crime in the Europe was set on the Nuremberg trial.
Yeah.
The winner side declared that everything the German did was the war crime, and nothing that they did was the war crime. There was an Indian Jew that was part of the court in on the Nuremberg trial, who tried to expand the definition of the war crime also on the things that British did to the Indian before the beginning of the World War II in the India, and also Indochina and all other things, but they did not recognize his trial. They don't allow him to put in the published that about 1,000 pages he wrote about these things that happens into the. Do you think that if the Europe defined the war crime as each crime against the humanity immediately after the Second World War, and agree that we also did war crimes after the Second World War, that this would avoid the war crimes that happened, let's say, in the Yugoslavia after the 90s, in Slovenia, in the Croatia, and in the Serbia also?
No. I understand what you're saying about during the Nuremberg trials. Actually, the American prosecutor wrote to Truman to say, we're prosecuting these people for war crimes that we ourselves have done. Our allies, the French, are treating their prisoners of war terribly, so badly that we're having to take them back. Our other allies, the Soviets, we're prosecuting the Germans for invading Poland. Well, the Soviets also invaded Poland at the same time. Not only that, but they've invaded the Baltic states now. So, and he didn't mention, of course, the various war crimes that the Americans themselves had done. Destroying whole cities was a war crime already before the Second World War. By the Hague Conventions, you cannot destroy whole cities indiscriminately. That is a war crime. So the British and the Americans were equally guilty of war crimes. But at the same time, they weren't on trial. It was you can't have it's called an et tu quo defense. You can't have a you too. You were also doing this defense. In a trial where you were on trial. So it was quite proper that they didn't allow this document from this Indian Jew, because that wasn't the issue. That's a separate issue. I'm not saying that it shouldn't have been looked at, but at the Nuremberg trials was not the place to do it. Now,
but the question is interesting because we got used to war crimes.
Yeah.
Okay, come on, so who cares anyway? It's the time of Twitter and Facebook, and you can follow pretty decent war crimes practically live from wherever they're happening, right? We build insulation. We have to fake actually horror and whatever. We got used to the idea that the war is horrible and this happens. And I think there was a rather cynical remark by I think it was a British general in Iraq, when they asked him how, because he was telling about the British and American casualties and how many Iraqis were killed during this operation, and he said, an army on the offensive counts only its own casualties.
Yeah.
You bury the rest. And this is, for wars, it's still rather clear what is okay and what is a crime. And then you get, afterwards, you get a war crimes tribunal, and you settle it through legal matters. But this was not war.
No.
And it's actually much better to do war crimes after the war, because nobody's held account. My English collapsed. Nobody's held account.
Held to account, yeah, yeah. I mean, the Nuremberg trials was trying to do. They were trying to do something was fairly impossible, actually. They were trying to create a kind of a world law. You know, there were each nation has its own laws. To create an international law, you've got to get everybody on board. And even still today, we have an international criminal court. It took till the 1990s, after the Yugoslavian genocides, and it took until then before they even considered it. So that's 50 years until they even begin to consider having an international criminal court. It didn't come into existence until 2003, I think it was. So, you know, that's 57 years after the Second World War is over. It's taken that long to even get to a point where we have an international criminal court. And even now, China's not a part of it, America's not a part of it, I don't think India's a part of it. To get everybody to join in all across the world, you've got to convince them that they give up their sovereignty over their own laws and put themselves at the mercy of a higher power over which they have no control. And you're not going to do that with America, with India, with China. It's not going to happen. So, you know, we have a very imperfect system. Nuremberg was only the very beginning of this. You know, it'll take another 1,000 years before we get to a point where there's an international law that we all have to obey.
We have another question.
After the First World War, nobody was put into the court because what they did into the First World War. No winner or loser general.
There were trials in Germany, but everyone walked away free.
So after the Second World War, okay, we find out the losers get punished. After the First World War, nobody was guilty. Nobody was punished because of it. After the Second World War in Nuremberg, we find out those who lost, those were guilty.
Yeah.
Do you think that now, after the Balkan Wars, at least we got the court in which they said also if you win, you could be guilty if you do something wrong?
Well, it's the beginning. You know, this is a really long process. It's like I say, it's taken us 60, 70 years to get this far, and we're still only not even halfway there. So, you know, it's a long process. I would love to see the situation where there was one law for everybody and everyone had to obey it. But, you know, this isn't going to happen overnight.
We have a question from
I don't have a question at this point, but listening to this discussion, let's just not forget who started the war. I mean, we are talking about winners and losers. I think the point is who started the war, right?
Yeah, absolutely. This is one problem that I found in a lot of books that I read during my research, was that you know, there were books about the Second World War where it was very clear, you know, the Nazis did this, and then, you know, they got defeated and it was all horrible, and then we ended up with everything happily ever after. Then there were these other books that were about the aftermath of the war, which were, this revenge happened, it was terrible, these evil partisans started killing people and putting them in mass graves. There was no sort of overlap which showed that, you know, actually the Ustasha started it, and then, you know, the partisans finished it. They were both terrible to each other. If you're determined to lay blame, obviously it begins with the Ustasha, and therefore, you know, you have to put the blame on them primarily. But that doesn't mean that you can't also apportion blame elsewhere, you know, additionally. So yeah, there is this there's this dividing line that I think is unhealthy between the Second World War and what happens afterwards. It's all part of the same thing.
Ste videli?
Ja.
Se upravičujem, sem vas blizu.
My name is Lily Potpera, and I would like to ask a slightly more personal question. It took me a few days to read the book in a few sittings, and it was a difficult experience. So I would like to ask you how you managed to sit with it for 5 years. How did it change you? What did it do to you, to your perception of the world, to you personally?
That's a good question. And I have to say, you know, actually while I was writing it, and researching it, I was very deeply focused on what I was doing, and I didn't really pay much attention to the effect that it was having on me. You know, I work. I have a house with a little garden. At the end, there's a little shed, a room where I work. And at the end of the day, I leave all my photographs of atrocities and so on in. I lock them away in there, and I go back into the house. So I have this sort of separate place where all the horror happens. Now that was fine while I was writing it, but then once I'd finished, I then was left with all this stuff which suddenly came flooding back, and I had to live with that. I was actually really quite depressed for a good couple of months after and exhausted, really emotionally exhausted. There are moments of hope in this book. I don't want to say that it's full of atrocity, but there's some pretty dark stuff in there, and I'm quite impressed that you managed to read it in a few days, because my wife, when she read it, she had to put it down after the first 7 or 8 chapters and leave it for a couple of weeks, because it's difficult. It's difficult to read some of these things.
It's difficult, but if I had put it away, I wouldn't have put it up again, but it's worth reading. I wanted to read it. It was doing something to me, changed me.
Yeah.
And it was so well written and so well translated. I read it in Slovene translation. So congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I have the light in my eyes. If somebody has a question, please be more aggressive. I don't see any. Oh, yes. We have one in the back. 2 more questions, and then we'll wrap it up. This one, 2 more. Get them, and then.
In pregovor latinski velja za večer, ki ga povzema.
Sam trenutek počakate, da vidimo, če tole dela. It doesn't work, so okay. Let's have a look. Do the match.
No, it's the hiss on that.
Zelo kratek bom. En latinski pregovor poznamo vsi. Historia magistra vitae est. Vendar pa z ozirom na vaše predavanje bi moral... Je razumel.
There's a note saying the historia magistra
vitae est. Jaz bi dopolnil z ozirom na vaše predavanje
The gentleman would like to make an addition connected to yours.
Historia magistra vitae non podesta. Ne povzemamo, ne rekapituliramo slabosti učitelja. Zato se vam zahvaljujem za vaše predavanje.
So what he's saying is that this saying should be modified into that we don't learn, or we learn very badly from history, and he wants to thank you for your intervention. Kakšnega vprašanja? Okay. So, come. Jaz ne vidim nobene roke. Oh. So, I don't see any more hands. Let's wrap it up. How did Europe get out of it? Because it did. And when we're talking about the aftermath, when does it end? If ever.
Well, in some respects, it's still going on, you could say. But you're right, Europe did get out of it. And I think, I mean, I've been quite scathing in some ways about national myths, but you know, myths are important for us. And the way we all got out of this mess was through the creation of these myths. So, individual nations created myths to sort of heal the wounds of the Second World War. So, you know, the French could become all heroes of the resistance. The Polish could, you know, hide themselves in their feeling of martyrdom. But more importantly, we have this this larger myth, this European myth, which grows out of the Second World War. You know, the Second World War is a cataclysm. It destroys everything. You have this Armageddon, but then you come out of it by saying, well, you know, this is an opportunity to rebuild a brand new world. We have a brand new world now where everybody can live in harmony and we can create something where we're all together. This myth still just about exists, although, you know, there are plenty of people trying to pick it apart. I like this myth. I know it's a myth, but I like to believe in it. And I think, you know, if you can bring yourself to believe in a constructive myth, even though it's a myth, there's no harm in that. I can live with that.
So, my last observation, isn't this what the Americans do?
It's what the Americans are great at. You know, how can you reconcile people who live in California, Texans, you know, with their big hats and and New Yorkers? They're all part of one country somehow. This is amazing, but they do it so well, and they do it by having a flag outside everybody's house, and the children, you know, learn the.
I pledge allegiance.
Yeah, exactly, all that. And it's hard work. You can't just do it for a little bit and then give up. You have to keep doing it year after year after year. Keep building those myths up. That's why the Americans are so good at it.
And so
we don't do that.
So this idea that Europe is getting Americanized, it's not really true.
No. We like our differences too much.
Okay, thank you very much for this. This was a brilliant. This book has the smell of the translation of the year, and Madame Bischek, who also translated this conversation, did a beautiful job. If anybody feels the urgent need to buy the book, he can buy it by the door somewhere. I hope it's true. And Keith Lowe, our guest tonight, will do that signing. Jaz vam najlepše zahvaljujem, da ste prišli, najlepše, da ste strpno poslušali in postavili vprašanja, ki so lepo dopolnila moje poskuse, da bi bil pogovor ploden. Najlepše hvala Podivjanu, ki je izdal knjigo Cankarjevem domu, ki nas je gostil, in vsem, ki so sodelovali pri pripravi tega dogodka, in lep večer želim.